This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal and professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video. Welcome to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about Deadwood, the most notorious town of the Wild West, authored by Radu Alexander. Be sure to check out my links below, including my storytelling channel, Story Rant, and if Radu has provided us with his links, they'll be right alongside my own. But without further delay, let's get into it. July 2nd, 1874, a cavalry regiment of the United States Army set off from Fort Abraham Lincoln in what was back then the Dakota Territory to explore an uncharted region known as the Black Hills. Led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the one from Custer's Last Stand, the expedition's main goals were to establish a good route through the Black Hills, find a suitable location for a fort, and ideally discovered some gold in them thar hills. Technically, all of this should have been irrelevant because according to the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, the Black Hills were the property of the Sioux people, so even if there was gold, it would belong to them, right? Well, as many of us know, the United States government regarded treaties with Native Americans more like suggestions than actual rules to be followed. So if there was anything of value there, nothing would stop it from claiming ownership and exploiting it. Unfortunately for the Sioux, Custer did find gold in the Black Hills. A lot of it. At least according to the reports he sent back, which were widely distributed in newspapers throughout the nation, which boldly proclaimed the Black Hills to be the new gold country. Once gold was on the table, multiple events followed in quick succession. By the fall of 1875, over 15,000 prospectors settled illegally in the Dakota Territory, risking their lives to sneak into the Black Hills and mine for gold. At first, the U.S. Army tried to stop them, at least pretending to abide by the treaty. Then it decided that it wouldn't do that anymore. Then, President Ulysses S. Grant offered to buy the Black Holes for $6 million, but Sioux leader Sitting Bull told them to stick it where the sun don't shine. Then the government announced that it was taking the land anyway and gave the Native Americans a deadline to leave their homes. Then the latter ignored the deadline and the Great Sioux War of 1876 erupted, because of course it did. By the way, if we may allow ourselves a shameless plug, we have a Geographics video on Sitting Bull, which presents the events from his perspective and includes the war and Custer's Last Stand and all that wonderful stuff. But what does any of this have to do with our video today? Well, as the miners came into the Black Hills, they settled new towns in the area. As it happened, one of the most desirable places to mine gold was also Deadwood Gulch, so naturally it attracted a lot of new traffic and led to the birth of one of the most notorious towns of the American frontier, Deadwood. There are a few origins for the name Deadwood, but the most popular one claims that when miners arrived in 1875, the valley had been clogged by a mass of fallen trees, most likely from a tornado. Like many of the early settlements in the Black Hills, Deadwood was founded illegally, back when the territory still technically belonged to the Native Americans. And also, like those other settlements, it started out as a humble mining camp. We can't tell you who was the first miner in Deadwood, since keeping accurate records wasn't exactly of paramount concern back then, and contemporary newspapers, as well as modern historians, have given credit to various people. But if you want a name, the one that often gets brought up is Frank Bryant, who arrived with a small party in Deadwood Gulch in August 1875. According to his son, Bryant found gold in Deadwood on August 11th, then built a small log cabin near the creek and worked his claim, although he did not actually register it until November. Another popular option would be a man named William Lardner and his group, and for what it's worth, this was the opinion shared by a guy named Seth Bullock, who some of you might already be familiar with, but more on him later. After these initial groups, several other parties found gold and recorded their claims in quick succession, so that By December of that year, the Lost Mining District had been set up by Lardner to keep records of all the new claims being registered. If you're wondering what made Deadwood such an appealing target, it was all about location, location, location. It was situated 4,600 feet above sea level, yet deep in the valley cut by Whitewood Creek, coming in from the Deer Mountains. Those mountains were rich in gold, and after thousands of years of rain and erosion, a lot of that gold got carried by water down the slopes and into the valley. It then reached Deadwood Gulch, where the creek developed a gentler incline that permitted the precious ore to get deposited in the stream bed, just waiting for prospectors to arrive with their pans and shovels and do one of those little jigs that they all love to do whenever they strike it rich. This kind of gold digging is called placer mining, where gold is extracted from sand and gravel typically deposited on the bed of a river. It can be as basic as using the aforementioned pan to sift through the sediment. It is a technique that has been used since ancient times, and although it won't likely yield any huge returns, it has the advantage that anyone can start doing it with little training and investment. Of course, more advanced methods were also available to the prospectors, such as using a device called a rocker, or even better, a sluice box, both capable of processing much more raw material. The problem with placer mining is that it doesn't last very long, especially once a spot becomes popular and attracts thousands of miners at once. Centuries of gold deposits can be sifted in just a few years, and when that happens, it is often replaced with hard rock mining, which, as its name suggests, involves searching for and extracting gold deposits from solid rock, a much more complex and expensive alternative that typically requires heavy machinery. Indeed, by the end of 1878, placer mining had already started to dry up in Deadwood. The humble prospectors who came to the area with a pan in their hand and a gleam in their eyes either moved on to greener pastures or sought employment with the mining companies that set up shop to work the gold veins in the mountains. Many claim holders made money not from gold, but from renting or selling their property to businessmen who wanted to build on the land, since by that point Deadwood had evolved into a fully fledged city. We're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. For now, it is still 1876 and Deadwood is still the promised land for many a prospector with dreams of diving into a pool filled with gold a la Scrooge McDuck. Nobody knows exactly how many miners arrived in Deadwood in 1876, but estimates for the summer of that year range from a conservative 5,000 to an ambitious 10,000. Of course, all those miners needed places to buy supplies, to process their ore, to sell their gold, and then to spend their hard-earned money. The gold rush naturally attracted new businesses run by people who had no intention of mining, but to cater to the demands of an ever-growing population. The summer of 1876 saw a construction boom in Deadwood, and before you knew it, the place turned from a mining camp full of tents, shanties, and maybe a log cabin or two into a proper settlement. Deadwood's so-called business district was initially described as a lot of lemon boxes dumped out in a backyard, some of them propped up on broomsticks. But by September, there were around 200 buildings in town. The population was estimated at around 3,000 people by the end of fall. At first, this might sound low given that 5,000 to 10,000 miners arrived during the summer, but keep in mind that most miners went home for the winter. The fact that so many stuck around showed that thousands of people had already made Deadwood their new home. One of the first people to do so was a man named Ethan Bennett Farnham, better known as E.B. Farnham to the people of Deadwood and the fans of the HBO show. He came to Deadwood from Wisconsin during the summer of 1876 and opened a general store, thus becoming one of the city's first residents who was not a miner or a prospector. Farnham then invested in more properties in and around town, but more importantly, he was elected by a provisional city government as Deadwood's first mayor and justice of the peace. Consequently, Farnham was responsible for a whole bunch of other firsts in Deadwood. He helped establish the first school and fire department, he sent the first telegram, and he officiated the first marriage in town. Aww. Plus, as mayor, he began levying taxes on businesses and organized a quarantine when a smallpox outbreak ravaged the town. In other words, E.B. Farnham was a pivotal character in the early years of Deadwood and was instrumental in establishing it as a proper city. One important distinction between the real Farnham and his TV counterpart was that the former didn't actually stick around Deadwood for long. Once the duties of the mayor were split into multiple positions, Farnham ran for justice of the piece again, this time unsuccessfully. After that, he decided to pack up his bags and move to Chicago, and by the 1880 census, Farnham was out of Deadwood. Another notable early resident that show enthusiasts will immediately recognize was Charlie Utter, a former trapper who decided to come to Deadwood to try his luck at prospecting. However, Utter didn't come alone. Instead, he and his brother Steve Utter organized a 30-wagon train in Colorado, filled it with miners, gamblers, and prostitutes, and brought them all to Deadwood to give the town a healthy dose of, let's say, liveliness. As if that wasn't enough, Utter even stopped on the way to pick up two Wild West icons, Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok. We might as well mention Wild Bill now, since he was undoubtedly Deadwood's most famous resident, albeit briefly. Hickok stayed in town for less than a month. He arrived in July on Utter's wagon train and was killed on August 2nd, 1876, while playing poker in Nettle and Mann's No. 10 saloon. By that point, Hickok was already a legend of the Old West, and if you want to get the full picture, we did a video on him over at Geographics a few years back. His killer was another local named Jack McCall. Why exactly McCall wanted Hickok dead still remains uncertain, but one day he walked up to Wild Bill while the latter was playing poker and shot him point blank in the back of the head, killing him instantly while Hickok was holding pairs of aces and eights, nowadays known as the dead man's hand. A group of locals captured McCall and held an impromptu trial, since this was during Deadwood's early days when it was still an illegal settlement. However, McCall claimed that he killed Wild Bill to avenge his brother's death, and since this was considered okay by frontier standards, they let him go. But McCall just couldn't keep his mouth shut, and he bragged about his deeds so much that he finally got arrested in Wyoming and put on trial again, a legit one this time. He was found guilty and hanged in 1877. Wild Bill Hickok was buried locally in Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery, where many other town notables rest to this day. As for Charlie Utter, Deadwood proved more beneficial to him than to his former partner. Soon after arriving in town, he established an express delivery service to Cheyenne, Wyoming. With the profits, he opened or managed several entertainment establishments, such as saloons and dance halls, not just in Deadwood, but also in nearby towns such as Lead and Gayville. Just like E.B. Farnham, the real Charlie Utter did not stick around Deadwood for too long. In 1879, the town was hit by a devastating fire that destroyed hundreds of buildings, including those owned by Utter. Like many people, he didn't feel like starting over from scratch, so he left Deadwood and drifted from town to town until he eventually ended up in Panama City, Panama. The last member of the famous trio was Calamity Jane, a frontierswoman and scout whose history before arriving in Deadwood seems more based on hearsay than any solid records. Even the origins of her nickname are a bit murky. She only stayed in Deadwood for a few years, but she was remembered fondly for nursing sick residents during the smallpox epidemic. Although she too moved on to greener pastures, including a stint with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. She returned to the Black Hills in her final years. She died in 1903 and was buried in Deadwood right next to Wild Bill Hickok. Some say this was done according to her final wishes. Others claim that they did it to play a joke on Wild Bill, since in life Jane was in love with him, but he had no interest in her. This Geographics video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform you can use to create a beautiful website. If you're an entrepreneur looking to stand out in today's crowded market, a professional website is absolutely essential. With Squarespace's new guided design system, it's easier than ever before to go from having no website to having a website running and earning a profit. This design system, Squarespace Blueprint, will take you through the process of building your site. You can choose from many style options and professionally curated layouts to create a website perfectly tailored to your needs. You might think that you have nothing worth selling, but one feature that Squarespace is proud to offer you is the ability to create your own online course. Do you have a particular skill or knowledge base that you could potentially teach? Set up your site, customize it, and upload your lessons. You can charge a one-time fee for access or sell subscriptions if you plan on creating an ongoing course. Squarespace has powerful payment tools to give your audience more flexibility at the checkout. Accept payments from credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay. In eligible countries, your customers can also buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code Geographics. Time is money, so don't waste yours waiting. Okay, enough pussyfooting around. Open up that can of peaches because it's time to talk about what really made Deadwood infamous, and it wasn't mining and sensible town planning either, but rather drinking, gambling, and the world's oldest profession, prostitution. The first working girls came to Deadwood on Charlie Utter's wagon train, and it's said that the miners were so happy to see them arrive that they lined the streets and started applauding as the wagons drove past. Soon enough, brothels opened by madams like Dirty M, Dora Dufresne, and Madame Moustache turned into some of the most lucrative businesses in town. Dufresne, in particular, became a pillar of the community, and she was so successful that she operated brothels throughout South Dakota, including in Lead, Sturgis, and Rapid City, although her joint in Belle Fourche was her biggest moneymaker, called Diddlin' Dora's. Dufresne was known for paying her workers a decent wage and maintaining a safe and clean environment, something that was definitely not the case in most Western brothels or in most strip clubs today, and also for employing Calamity Jane as a cook from time to time. Both Dufresne and her husband were buried in Deadwood, and although she does not appear in the HBO show, the character of Joni Stubbs was loosely based on her. If you had money to spend and were looking for a good time in Deadwood, there were plenty of options available to you. There was the Melodeon, which had plenty of music, faro tables, live shows, and all the sleaze that money could buy. There was the Green Front, which had more of the same, and then there was the Bella Union, which again was basically the same as the first two, but it was featured in the show, so it's more famous. And if you wanted something that was genuinely more upscale and less disreputable, you had Jack Langrish's theater, where you could see proper plays, host weddings and church services, and even catch an opera or two. Langrish was an Irish immigrant born in Dublin who began acting in New York City before starting his own theater troupe and taking it on the road. He arrived in Deadwood early on and built his theater in the summer of 1876. Langrish represented the more respectable side of Deadwood's entertainment industry during its first years, but like many of the local businessmen, he left town after the devastating fire of 1879 burned his place to the ground. But of course, when it came to the entertainment district of Deadwood, one place stood head and shoulders above all others in terms of infamy: the Gem Theater and its notorious owner, Al Swearingen. The real Swearingen was a no-good scoundrel through and through, just like his TV counterpart. Although probably a little less murdery, he was, however, ruthless and shady, particularly with the women in his employ, whom he often tricked into working at the Gem as prostitutes by promising them respectable jobs if they came to Deadwood. But you don't have to take our word for it. Here is how contemporary author and first-hand witness John S. McClintock described Swearingen and the Gem. On the east side of Main Street was constructed early in June a large two-story frame building. This abominable institution was later known far and wide as the Gem Theater, by reason of its drawing financial support from so many of the so-called leading citizens of the city, as well as from practically all residents and floaters of the underworld who drifted into the hills at the time. It very soon won and held for many years, to the everlasting shame of Deadwood, the distinction of being the city's chief attraction. The floor in front was provided with a bar on one side and with seats for waiting patrons and spectators on each side. The rear end of the long building was cut up into small rooms. It was here that Swearingen kept under strict surveillance his herd of so-called female employees, when in fact they were on the level of white slaves. Swearingen kept at all times a full crew of understrappers, with Dan Doherty as general manager and Johnny Burns as floor manager, and several burly bouncers whose duties were to see to it that those who had spent their money kept quiet or hit the sidewalks. On one occasion, as I was passing up the street, I heard a great clash of voices and a shot fired. I waited until others had rushed in, and following them I beheld a man lying on the floor with a bullet hole clear through his head, back of his eyes. The woman Trixie had grabbed a pistol while he was beating her and turned the tables on him. This vicious institution in its later years was conducted principally as a theater and frequently procured some of the best talent found among traveling attractions. However, it continued to end in maintaining its notorious record as a defiler of youth, a destroyer of home ties, and a veritable abomination. So yeah, McClintock was not a fan of Swearingen or the Gem, but many others were, and the Gem stayed in business for over 2 decades. After the Big Fire of 1879, Swearingen rebuilt his successful brothel and then did it again after another fire ravaged Deadwood's main street in 1894. The third fire did it though, and after the Gem burned down again in 1899, Swearingen called it quits and left Deadwood for Chicago. He was found dead on the streets of Denver in 1904, likely the victim of a homicide that remains unsolved to this day. But what about the other side of the coin? Swearingen represented the chaos and crime that helped gain Deadwood its reputation, but the city also had those who stood for law and order, and chief among them was legendary lawman Seth Bullock. Bullock and his partner Solomon Starr arrived in Deadwood in early August 1876 and proceeded to open the first hardware store in town. By all accounts, Bullock arrived in Deadwood intent on doing business, not to deliver justice. But the lawlessness of the wild frontier proved too much for him to stomach. He had previously served as sheriff in Montana, and yes, in case you're wondering, the opening scene in the show where Bullock hangs a man instead of turning him over to an angry lynch mob was real. The guy's name was Clell Watson. Bullock reached Deadwood around the time that Wild Bill Hickok was murdered, and it seems that he wasn't the only resident who would have liked the town to be maybe just a tad less wild. Fighting, drinking, gambling, opium, and prostitution were all just good, clean American fun, but McCall being able to walk up to Hickok and shoot him in the head in broad daylight, and then being let go was a bit much even for Deadwood. The citizens started calling for a sheriff to bring some law and order, and in fact, they elected one right after McCall's trial. And guess what? It wasn't Bullock. It was some guy named Isaac Brown, but he was killed just a few weeks later. It wasn't until March 1877 that Seth Bullock became the sheriff not just of Deadwood, but of Lawrence County, as appointed by Territorial Governor Pennington. Bullock immediately deputized a few trusted men and got to cleaning up the town as best he could. Deadwood hardly became a safe haven with him in charge, but it was better than before. As you would imagine, Bullock had several run-ins with Swearingen, but the Gem proprietor was too popular and well-connected to get taken down by the new sheriff. According to records, Bullock never killed a man during his time as Lawrence County Sheriff. He didn't have to. It was said that he could outstare a mad cobra or a rogue elephant, and a look from him was usually enough to dissuade most unruly citizens from starting any trouble. That being said, Bullock wasn't sheriff for very long. In November of that same year, a federal judge voided all Deadwood appointments, and elections were held for the open positions. Bullock surprisingly lost the sheriff job to a guy named John Manning. However, he was later appointed as U.S. Marshal by President Teddy Roosevelt directly, and he held that job for 9 years. Bullock and Sol Starr were vital members of Deadwood's community because they became permanent fixtures who lived in town for the rest of their lives, always trying to make Deadwood bigger and better. They didn't just pack up and leave when the fires burned down their businesses, which did indeed happen. Together, they built the Bullock Hotel, which is still in operation, and they granted free use of their land to the Fremont, Elkhorn, and Missouri Valley Railroad so that they would build a railway through Deadwood. Starr got involved with politics and served as Deadwood councilman, mayor, and postmaster. Later, when South Dakota became a state, he served as state legislator and senator. Both men died in Deadwood, and while Bullock was buried locally, Starr's family had him transported to St. Louis. But the gold rush wouldn't last forever. At the 1890 census, the population of Deadwood was only 2,366 people. Many of its landmarks had burned down. Many of its colorful characters had left town. Gambling and prostitution had become illegal, and then so did alcohol, as North and South Dakota enacted Prohibition in 1889. Deadwood had become just another small town. The once lawless boomtown was a shadow of its former unruly self, although its rebellious and violent origins are still remembered and even celebrated during the days of the 76th annual event. Its place in American history was officially cemented in 1961 when the entire town of Deadwood was declared a National Historic Landmark. Well, I certainly hope you found the script this video was based on to be as informative and entertaining as I did. Be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and stay tuned to Geographics for more content like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.